Howdy everybody, Kamikaze Avalanche here, and I wanted to go over today a Godot tutorial for how I set up my configuration file for player settings. First off, what do I mean by player settings? So when I go to my settings menu, which I can reach from anywhere in the game, I have a bunch of settings that are not part of any particular game run, but they're settings for the player. These are things such as the volume, the music volume, the sound effects volume. So here, let me make some sound effects for you, muting the main volume, and some preferences for how the player wants to experience the game, if the player has full screen or not. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about player settings here. And this tutorial is going to be for setting up this type of environment. So as I'm trying to do a 5-step process with each of these tutorials, and the first step is understanding the use case for having a text file that has player settings. So a settings text file, let me get out of here because we don't need to be in the game anymore. I want to store that in the players folder. So if I go to project and I go open user data folder, this is where I want to keep it. And this folder, it's going to work no matter where you export the game. If it's Macintosh, Windows, iOS, wherever, it doesn't matter, it's going to work. And it's going to look like this. I want it to be a configuration file. So you see I've got the 3 areas. I've got audio, and I've got the volume. You remember it was false for muted on the master volume. It is muted for the music. It is not muted for the sound effects. We had that full screen set to true, which it can be toggled off. And then we have the player preferences for how they like to experience the game. And this can be a flat text file because we don't care about the user coming in here and messing with things in the meantime. In fact, if the end user wants to come in here and change full screen from true to false and then save it and boot it up, all the best to them. If they want to start the game muted, they could come in here and change this false to a true, and that's fine. We're okay with the user messing with this configuration file however they want to get the experience that they want to experience. So that's the first step, is understanding that use case scenario. We're not storing any game settings. We're not storing anything like that. So this flat text file with the structured data is perfect for this particular use case. All right, so in here, the second step is I need to set up all of these variables that I want the player to be able to adjust. So in that, I'm creating this globals autoload. And just a quick primer, if you're not familiar with what an autoload is, if I go into project and I go to globals, I have scripts and scenes that load whenever the game is loaded. So I have this one, and I want it to be a TSCN. I want it to be a scene instead of just a script. I could just load the globals as globals.gd and just have the script, but I get a lot of advantages when I have a scene and the script is attached to the scene, as you see here, where I've got just the globals as a node, and then the script. And the main advantage I'm getting is when I come into the globals, I set here in this first block, I have sound files that I want to be consistent across my game, and I'm just storing those in globals. But as a scene, you can see I set it up as an export variable, and I can drag those sound files into here. I've got an export category for these player settings, and these are the settings that we saw in that menu. So the export variables I have set in here, and these are the ones that are those player settings that the player is messing with. You can see there they are in here, and if I'm testing something out, the other advantage of this being a scene instead of just a script is I can change these on the fly to test settings if I get rid of that config file and want to see what's going on. So if you don't have this set up, you should come in here, create a global scene with a node, attach a script to it, and you put all those export variables that you want in here that the player can change. Go to project settings, globals, and you add it as an autoload. Let's say I was opening that as an autoload, but I'm not going to, and then click add, and then it should come in here. And so now that global scene will boot up every time you open the game. So that's the second step, is you need to set up a global autoload with the export variables that you want the user to have. Now that we have this globals that runs, well, whenever the user opens up the game, I want to load up their settings, right? So when it gets ready, I want to, if that configuration file exists, I want to load it. So the first thing we do is a function onReady. So when the game boots up, when this scene loads up, we're going to check to see if the file exists. users://settings.cfg. And you could have it be .ini, whatever you want. It's just going to be a text file. But I'm going with CFG because that's kind of a standard. So if it exists, we're going to load it. Now, if it doesn't exist, what's going to happen? Well, with these export variables, it's going to take the default value, or if I'm running it in the editor, right, the settings I have in the editor, if I've configured it here. See, that was one of the advantages I mentioned of having this be a scene instead of just a script. If it's a scene, I can change these to have a different experience for the default player. However, if I don't have a config file, it's going to take these numbers here, right? Main volume's 100, music volume's 100, sound effects volume's 100. Maybe I should change that to not start off muted. That's probably a good idea. I really don't want players to start off muted the first time they're playing the game. All right, a note for self to fix that. All right, so jumping back into the script, if the file exists, we're going to load the config, right? And load config is a function, and I'm creating a new temporary variable, config equals ConfigFile.new. Then if it errors out, then we're going to put that in there, but that it would have errored out up here earlier, so we don't have to worry about that. Then we're going to go through and look at the lines, and we're going to first look at the category, and then we're going to look at the setting. And let me actually see if I can go back up into the config file. And just for understanding of this, right, the audio in the brackets is the major section, and then we have the individual settings. So just remember this format when we go back to the script. We have the major area, and then we have the individual variables. So here you're going to see the major area is audio, and the line is called master volume. And then when we load it, we're going to set this export variable main volume to whatever the number was after that line. And we're going to do this for each of the lines in that config file. Full screen. Here you see we've got video. So this is in that second area. And then we have the player preferences as well. So right here, I'm reading the file, I'm going through, I'm looking for those variables in each of those sections, and I'm setting the global variable that we see up here to those numbers, or true, that false. After I've done that, I'm going to apply the settings. So that's another function, and when I apply settings, I'm changing my audio server to those volume levels. I'm muting them or unmuting them. I am changing it to be full screen or windowed mode, depending on the results. I'm setting a variable that affects how fast the enemies move, whether they move fast or whether they move slow. I had some other variables, but I actually call to those from the global file from within the relevant part. So when I'm setting the character's icon, whether I choose their class or the race, when I'm drawing the cards, whether I have the easy to see cards or I'm using the fancy cards that have a lot of graphics, whether the enemy stat block is visible or not, and how much space it takes up. Those are called within the relevant part of the game, so I don't need to apply those right here. Alright, so that's the load functionality. So how does the save functionality work? Well, it works very similar to how the load works. Instead, we have a different function here called save game settings. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm creating a new config file variable, and then in config.setValue, I'm setting those exact same settings. So the same format we had here, the section it's in, and then the line's individual name, and then I'm calling that export variable, that variable here, and I'm setting the value to that. One thing to note here with the load config is you can also have it load a default variable, and I needed to do this because I didn't add the tarot card art until way later in the game. So if a player had their game updated to include the tarot cards, they wouldn't have this setting in their save file. So when a player gets the new patch, since this is a completely new setting, they wouldn't have had this line in their code. So I needed to set a default of false to have the person not experience an error when they loaded the game. All right, sorry for that detour. Going back to the save game settings. So we're going to set all of the values that we want to, and then config.save, and then where we're saving the file, and it's the exact same one that we're loading. Using this user format, we're going to be safe because Godot sets that user folder depending on what environments the player is playing the game in. It will have different settings for iOS or Android or Macintosh or Linux, wherever. Alright, so we've understand what's going on. Here we have our globals. We've set it as an auto load, and we have the save and the load functionality. So the next step we need to go to is we need to look at the options menu. So here we're in the options menu. One thing to note, you'll notice that I've got different text here, and I have it in all caps with this underscore between, because this is for localization efforts. I have a CSV file that loads into the game, and if the player is playing in English, they're going to see full screen. If it's in a different language, they're going to be a different way. Check out my tutorial for localization if you want to see how that works. But here we have the options menu, and this menu is called and instantiated from basically anywhere in the game if they hit the escape key. So this is going to be its own scene that gets instantiated into wherever the player is if they want to tweak these settings. So, you know, it uses the normal format right now of I'm using a panel container for the visual effects, so I have consistency across my game. I have all the buttons and everything in here. But the key part of this is the script. So in here, the first thing that's going to happen is when someone loads this up, the ready portion of it is going to be looking at all of those global variables, and it's going to be setting each of the settings based on those global variables. So if the person had set it so that they want to use the tarot cards, we're going to say that the button is pressed. So it's already going to be filled out based on their settings. If one of them is muted, it's going to be muted. And we're going to show the numbers of the music volume, etc., etc. And then the last thing I'm doing is I'm moving the mouse or the settings to that save button just so that they can navigate with the arrow keys and what have you. All right, so when this loads up, we're going to set the buttons with whatever settings that they already have with that ready function. When the user toggles a setting, we have these signals. So if they come in and they click that mute button on the master volume, I've gone in here and double click this for this signal, and it's gonna let me double click this if I can get a double click going, and it's going to say where do you want to connect to, and I want to connect it to that root script. I don't actually want to do this for that, but when I do that for that master mute box, or let me go for the latest one I add, it's going to have a new function, and it's going to be based on the node name underscore toggled, and it's going to say if toggled, it's bool. So when someone ticks that on or ticks that off, in that little function, I want to change the global variable based on the status of whether it's toggled on or toggled off. And then I'm going to play a little sound effect. This particular example, the tarot cards being toggled or not, it doesn't have any immediate effect, but I do have ones that do have immediate effect. I actually don't have the script for those coming up to the main. I have script coming up to that individual one, to the master volume, because I'm doing some additional manipulation. But so for this one, when the volume slider is changed, I am of course going to be changing the volume variable in that global's autoload, but I also want to set the text value of that, and then I'm setting that bus's volume to the value, because I also need to immediately change the volume. If they mute it, I need to immediately mute that volume or not mute that volume. So when they tick the button, again, it's just the same node connecting, right? Come in here. When it's toggled, when the slider value is changed, I want to have that immediate effect. All right, so coming back to this options menu layer, so we auto-load the values based on the global variables. When the player changes one of these variables, we're changing the game state and we're changing that variable in globals. And then the important one is if they hit that save button. So let me go and find this save button. We'll take a look at that one. Probably easier if I click it there. Right. So when this is pressed, what am I doing? Aha. I'm going to that globals autoload, and I'm kicking off that save game settings function. So if I hold down Control and click it, we can see it's coming back to this function where we create the config file and we set all of the values in it, and then we save it. All right, so there we have it. Let me come over and see if we hit all of our steps. We talked about the use case scenario for using a settings text file. We've set up a global auto load. We've set the variables. We programmed in the save and the load functionality for it. We created a config menu with the player options, and we have it so that when the player changes those options, it changes those variables in the global auto load, and we've given the player a button to save those settings. So it looks like we've hit all 5 steps, and hopefully you picked up something. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like so other people can enjoy the video, and good luck with your game development journey. Take care.